just to find out my story about my activism and what I did for Kenya.
I saw in him a person of extraordinary ability, not just his ability to communicate, but his intellectual power was extraordinary. Tajudeen knew that the power of the pen could convey perhaps messages in words in which verbally someone could not actually do so. And as I stand here, I look over from Oxford. We both finished at about the same time. I took an academic career. Tajudeen wanted to change the world and said he was a Pan Africanist. He was returning to the continent and he was going to embrace that goal.
Tajudeen provided a home through Arab, along with people like Zaya, for people that were on the Kenyan underground. People like Wanyiri Kihoro, like the late Wanjiru Kihoro. So that was one of the spaces where we used to meet. People who were on the underground, not just from Kenya, but from all the other African countries. People who had left Ghana because they were not happy about what was happening in Ghana. I met Yao Graham through Tajudeen. I met people who we now know about his work through Tajudeen. And so that warmth of Tajudeen, Tajudeen was a big man, and I'm not talking about his girth. Tajudeen's heart was huge. Tajudeen had a heart for Africa.
And Abdurrahman said, whatever you do, Girmay, while you're here in London, make sure you don't leave London without meeting this Tajudeen from Nigeria. And I said, okay, you're going to have to get me his contact, but now I have a meeting to go to at SOAS, and I had to rush to this meeting, and only to walk into that meeting and see this firebrand absolutely shooting words left and right, shaking the audience. I mean, I said, who is this man? And somebody said, Tajudeen. And it was very nice meeting him, because when they brought him to me and said, this is the man, the EPLF man from Eritrea, he first said, so now we have to debate about Pan-Africanism and socialism. Sit down. This man has nerves.
It was a very lively and loud conversation. Lots and lots of laughter. And we hadn't noticed, but there was next to us a couple, a white couple. I think they were trying to enjoy their dinner. And after a while, the gentleman got up and came to our table and said, excuse me, please, could you keep your voices down? We are trying to have dinner here. Immediately our table went quiet. Then Tajudeen pulled back his chair and got up. And at that point, the whole room went quiet. The whole restaurant at Aberdare Country Club went quiet. He turned around, looked at this man and said, you are exactly the kind of a person I've been waiting to meet. And the rest of the conversation was really awful.
He also was a person who brought us together with the other African struggles. I have colleagues like Zaya Yebu here. The passionate campaigns that he was always involved with Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya. After meeting Abdurrahman Mohamed Babu, who had visited the liberated territories, and at that time I edited a magazine called Africa Events, in which many of the articles on the Eritrean struggles were published, he was convinced that in fact it was a struggle that was worth the African people to get involved. And he was in fact very vigorous in campaigning on the issue of Eritrea eventually, to the point that in fact he became one of the voices of the Eritrean.
Irungu, Deve and Wole accompanied the body to Nigeria. From Nairobi, they flew to Addis Ababa, where they had a 3-hour stopover and thereafter headed for Lagos.
The three of us had accepted to represent the community from Kenya and to make sure that the body would be accompanied from Nairobi right through to Abuja, where it would be received by Nigerian and other African comrades. The three of us found it very difficult to sleep that night, but the one thing that we felt very confident about is that we were taking him home, and that this was the right decision to have done, rather than, as we had considered, burying him in Nairobi.
They arrived at dawn.
As we arrived in Lagos airport, we found several comrades and friends there. We found BC, we found Napoleon, we found Kayode, we found Adiambo, a whole range, Adebayo, a whole range of Nigerian-based colleagues were there.
The casket was again aboard another local flight to Abuja just 2 hours after its arrival at Murtala Muhammad Airport.
We found Munira and Aisha and Aida there, and small Aisha said, I want to ride in the car. I want to ride in the car with my daddy. So she got into the ambulance and she drove the 500 kilometers north to the state of Katsina and to the very village that Tajudeen had been born. So as we drove down this little stretch of road to Tajudeen's house, the heavens just broke. And it rained for a while. And I thought this is going to make the ceremony even more difficult. But of course, recognizing that in African culture, this is ultimately a blessing. And that for it to happen at this point was not just a coincidence, but obviously is linked to some, greater power that, even Tajudeen, with all his charisma and personality, respected. As we arrived at the house, the rain stopped. And I still don't quite understand how that happened, but we drove in and we found the compound full, completely full, almost saturated with men, women, children.
As the sun sets a day after his death, Taju's body was prepared for burial according to the Islamic tradition.
He was then wrapped traditionally as it is in accordance with Islam in a white cloth and carried in a small basket above the heads of the men.
It was thereafter carried to the mosque for prayers and eventually to the graveyard.
And after the prayers took place, we then left the mosque and proceeded to the final resting ground. The burial site had been dug in accordance with the Islamic faith, and he was then placed in the grave and covered initially with boards.
When we came back to the house, he told me he will go by himself because he was going for only 2 days. So he will leave the car at the airport, then when he comes, he'll drive himself back home.
On the Pan-African front, some would ask, was he compromised after joining the United Nations Millennium Programme? Did he tone down his voice in championing issues affecting Africa? As a General Secretary of the Global Pan-African Movement, what was discussed and agreed upon during the historical 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda? The answers to some of these questions will be contained in the forthcoming comprehensive video documentary, which will take us through Taju's journey.
Most of our countries produce what they don't consume. They consume what they don't produce. And the price of both is determined from outside.
Tajudeen Abdul-Raheem is definitely not with us anymore, but he will forever be alive, for his deeds live and will continue to guide and influence us in the future.
He was a very caring husband, a very caring, loving, humane person, and the years that I spent with him were the most fantastic years in my life any woman could dream of having.
During his lifetime, he resisted exploitation on the basis of color or race. He was in the forefront to champion for freedom, dignity, and the unity of Africans. Don't agonize, organize was his favorite slogan, a signature at the end of his emails, articles, and speeches.